You're listening to Ottawa Now with Evan Solomon on News Talk 580 CFRA.
Welcome back to Ottawa Now. I am Chris Sims filling in for Evan Solomon all week this week. Joining me now is Tom Harris. He is the Executive Director of the International Climate Science Coalition. And Mr. Harris, we spoke yesterday off the air after I finished interviewing the Progressive Conservative critic for energy here in Ontario when we were having a discussion about how carbon could or should be taxed in Ontario and where it should wind up on the energy bill, whether as part of a delivery charge or as a separate individual printed line on your bill. And then you and I started talking about taxing carbon at all. Should we be taxing carbon in Ontario, in your opinion?
Well, no. And in fact, it's funny because a lot of this discussion is right out of 1984. You remember they said war is peace. Well, they call carbon dioxide carbon. Carbon is soot, okay? Carbon is things like graphite. But carbon dioxide, see, they don't call it a carbon dioxide tax. And
they don't call it CO2 anymore. They say carbon tax, yeah.
That's right. And the reason they do that is because it brings up the idea of something that's dirty, like soot. If they called it a carbon dioxide tax, you'd have grade 5 students that would be saying, what? You're going to tax plant food? It's invisible. It's good for the planet. So they don't call it that. And there's all kinds of things that we see in the climate debate that, in fact, are using vernacular, which really helps promote the idea that they're fighting pollution. In fact, Kathleen Wynne, when she made her announcement about cap and trade, which, by the way, came in on July 1st, and that's hitting all of our producers of anybody greater than a certain level of CO2 emissions. So that is, in fact, the original tax. So what we're having now is not just a tax on a tax, but a tax on a tax on a tax, because the original producers are having, as of July 1st, to partake in this cap and trade. And then we'll be taxing their products, and as you said, a tax on a tax. So the whole thing is based on the idea that Ontario and the developed world can somehow magically control the climate. Now, even if the science behind that were solid, and it certainly isn't, there is absolutely no way that we can control the climate for the simple reason that China and developing countries, who now put out most of the CO2 from human activities, they have an out clause in the UN treaty. And in fact, they cornered the Chinese ambassador in the Peru event, the Peru COP conference back in 2014, and they asked him, this doesn't quite sound right. And he said, yes, but we're not going to change it. China is still a developing country, and they have an out clause. They say their first and overriding priority is not greenhouse gas emission reduction. It's pulling their people out of poverty. So they're going to, in fact, continue to burn coal. They're going to continue to emit greenhouse gas emissions while we will be crippled for nothing.
Is it fair to say that you are a skeptic of anthropogenic climate change, also known as man-made global warming?
Not really. What we are is we're people that question the extent of the amount of warming that we're causing. I mean, undoubtedly, in a city, for example, it's warmer because of the urban heat island. And CO2 probably has some effect on climate. Certainly, it helps keep the world, otherwise it would be an ice ball. It helps keep the world warm.
Right. Any of us who maybe were raised in the 80s, this would have been called the greenhouse effect. That's what it was called then.
Exactly. And the greenhouse effect is real. There's no question about it. But the real fundamental question is, are we causing dangerous climate change? Climate change that's so serious that it's worth spending what right now is $1 billion a day across the world trying to stop. I mean, that money is going to trying to stop something that might happen in the future because the current changes are so tiny. 2015, they said, it was the hottest year on record. You know how much it broke the record by? It broke the record by 1/4 of a degree Fahrenheit. So these changes are minute. Even in the last century, we've seen only a 0.85 degrees Celsius rise. I mean, it's a good thing it's risen, too, because, of course, who wants to live in Dickinson's time, in the Little Ice Age? So the kind of changes that are actually occurring in nature are minute. They're so small we can't even feel them. So the whole climate scare is based on the idea that the computer models, which forecast climate in the year 2080, that those are worth basing policy on, worth billions of dollars. But nobody knows that.
And you don't believe that it is worth basing policy on?
Not at all. In fact, when we can forecast next week's weather, then I might take a little more confidence in the science for forecasting climate in the year 2050. But, the main problem in Ontario is that we don't have an effective opposition. Whether it's Kathleen Wynne's plan or some unannounced yet plan from the Progressive Conservatives, it's really a debate about whether you want to be hung or shot. I mean, both of them are determined to tax carbon dioxide. And so we cornered Patrick Brown at a hearing last week in Stittsville at a town hall, and we asked him, do you think carbon dioxide is causing dangerous climate change? And it took me 10 times asking that question until he finally said, I don't know. And he also said he didn't think there was a consensus in the science community. Yet he said exactly the opposite at the Progressive Conservative Convention and when he was speaking to Evan Solomon the very next day after our town hall. And he said, and this is what Patrick Brown said, he said, I'm not going to lose the election over the climate debate. He said, I'm searching for liberal votes in downtown Toronto. And you think, what? Like a progressive conservative leader who's going to abandon a basic conservative policy, namely making sensible decisions about the environment, looking after things that are important.
Now, to be fair, I'm gonna try to play devil's advocate here because we don't have him on the line. So to be fair, quite often people will say in political war rooms and where they're coming up with strategy, they'll say, listen, let's say Tom, Dick, or Harry, or Mary or Susan, we may or may not be skeptics of whether or not we should be taxing carbon, a basic element of life on Earth, or CO2, which, as you described, is plant food. However, people are very concerned about the environment, both small e and capital E. They want clean water, they want clean air, and just speaking from their perspective, if the news media or academics or scientists that are writing in all peer-reviewed and respected journals are saying one thing, and that is often that humans are causing severe and drastic climate change. If we don't change our ways and limit our amount of CO2 emissions, we are going to not only hurt the environment, but our children and grandchildren. And then, Mr. Harris, if people believe that, whether or not it's true, I'm not making an opinion there, but if they believe that in their heart of hearts and then will vote based on it, I think that's the argument that some progressive conservatives and big C conservatives are saying of, you know what, you can't fight 80% of the electorate on this one issue and then wind up losing the election after election, and then you wind up with higher taxes, say, or you wind up with not spending on the military, things that you also find important. And then maybe that's what he was trying to say, is that I don't want to lose it on this one issue. Can you understand that?
Oh, yeah, I fully understand. I used to work as the legislative assistant for Bob Mills in the House of Commons.
Yes.
So I do understand that you can't just suddenly jump to say, oh, we're not causing dangerous climate change. What you need to do, though, is you have to have a strategy that makes sense. And the strategy of actually supporting the climate scare, the way Patrick Brown is doing, doesn't make any sense. I mean, what he needs to do is to start changing the language, start talking about carbon dioxide tax, start talking about the fact that research on groundwater pollution is being reduced more and more and more because we're spending so much on climate change. The fact that 5 million Africans a year are dying due to bad drinking water because they don't have electricity to run their wells. Now, so he has to gradually change the debate. He has to focus on, are we really more concerned about the possible problems in 50 years than we are about helping people today? In other words, he has to be practical. It's kind of like you have someone on the ground bleeding to death, and you stand over them and you say, well, I wonder what university you're going to go to. You have to actually look at immediate problems first. And many people around the world need help, for example, adapting to climate change. And yet, of that $1 billion a day spent on climate change, only 6% of it goes to helping real people today. And, Africans and people in the North, they're all appalled by that because they can't get help. And these are the kinds of pieces of information that he doesn't have to actually talk about the science, but he can talk about the division of funds. Does it make sense to spend all that money trying to help what might happen in the future when real people are suffering due to climate change right now? The UN even wanted it to be a 50-50 split. But a 94-6 split. I was speaking to Anita Vanderbilt at her climate change town hall, and she's very much on the side of David Suzuki. And I told her this, and she said, "What? See, that's crazy." So you can introduce into the debate very valid points, which make people take a second look at this.
Tom Harris, Executive Director of the International Climate Science Coalition. You raised some very interesting points. If any of our listeners in CFRA Nation want to agree, disagree, or bring up their own points on this, please email us, ottawanow@cfra.com, ottawanow@cfra.com. Mr. Harris, thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
Okay, thanks, Chris, for bringing up the topic.
You bet. That is, once again, Tom Harris. He's the Executive Director of the International Climate Science Coalition, and he always raises these very pointed questions when it comes to this topic. Let me know what you think. Do you separate CO2 from what we would often refer to, if we were kids in the 70s, 80s, as air pollution, of smog? Do you compare those two things? Email me, ottawanow@cfra.com.